Welcome to the Voice of MPE. In this MPE Talk series, we're going to be bringing you fresh insights from top industry leaders and payments professionals. False positives are a silent killer of revenue and a $600 billion problem that no one talks about. So today, I want to unpack this, and I'm here with leading fraud strategist Chen Zamir, our expert guest, who is centered on false positives, data enrichment, and the hidden revenue losses most merchants want to know about. So everyone in payments is talking about fraud, but nobody really talks about the revenue that gets lost by accidentally blocking your own customers. And today we're going to fix that. So false positives cost more than fraud, actually. So up to 75% more than actual fraud attacks, yet only get a fraction of the attention. So joining me here is somebody, as I said, expert fraud strategist Chen Zamir, who's been shouting the truth long before it's become fashionable, strategist, author and founder of the Saturday Fraud Strategist. So please, let's start with your expert insights.
Yes, thanks. Hi, Candice, and I'm super eager to get into this one with you.
So what I'd really like to do is start with something bold that you said in your latest newsletter. So most businesses, most of the time, don't actually have a fraud problem. So where do you say that?
Yeah, so I'll take a step back and I will try to explain. So when you look at your fraud system and you think about how it can actually fail in two manners. One, it can not block fraud, right? It can let fraud pass through. And the second one is that it can actually block good users, good legitimate users. Now, the first failure is very loud. You get chargebacks, clients are yelling at you, the board is yelling at you, your mom is yelling at you, everybody's yelling at you, right? It's very, very loud when you get a fraud attack. When you block good users, usually when you produce false positives, usually it is a very silent fail. Yes, you might get some complaints here and there, but generally speaking, it is definitely not as loud. And then businesses stop paying attention to the fraud system. They only pay attention while it breaks loudly. And so I think what happens is that unless you're a very early stage merchant, for example, or fintech, PSP, whatever, and you're encountering fraud for the very first time, it is likely that you've already put some measures in place. And even if they are very crude and they are creating a lot of false positives, you're not necessarily aware of them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, fraud is totally visible, and we put all sorts of things in place to try and mitigate that risk. But false positives are invisible, and it's the fraud that gets the headlines. So false positives get silence, and the silence does prove to be expensive. So I really couldn't agree with you more. And in my world, at US Bank Elavon, I work with merchants who are obsessed, as I say, with stopping that fraud. But when I actually start to dig into the decline data, I see the real pain is where they're blocking thousands of genuine customers at checkout. So I'm quite interested to know, vendors that merchants work with and I have conversations with, they don't talk about reducing the false positives. You also pointed out something fascinating to me in your write-up about why platforms lead with catching sophisticated fraud and instead of protecting good customers. Why is that when this is such a big issue and actually twice as big as fraud chargebacks in cost terms?
Yeah, I think there are several effects that come into play. The main one is how do you sell in general? And usually you sell solutions to problems, to certain pain points. And I think it is first and foremost much easier to sell a solution to a pain that is very loud, as we just described. It's much easier than selling a solution to a pain that you're not really necessarily aware of. And it's even harder to educate you that you actually have this pain and we can help you with it by this and that. It's very hard to quantify this. So I think it is just easier to highlight these pains. And honestly, also we see like generally in the industry, a lot of scare tactics and, highlighting very sophisticated fraud attacks that theoretically can happen, but they represent a very, very, very small size of the overall fraud topologies that we see. But it's just easier to maybe scare you into action like that, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's true. Fear does sell, but it is a much more compelling conversation to have when I look at the data and can show with sophistication that we can reduce those false positives, even by a small percent, and depending on the volume, it can lead to millions in uplift. So you're right, fear sells, and no one wants to kind of put on their website that we're amazing at improving the people you already like, but it's actually, making sure that you keep good customers. I did read that 1 in 2 merchant or customers that end up being blocked, they will never come back to your site. So it's actually a huge issue, and I think people need to be much more aware of it. So would you actually look if you wanted to reduce false positives? So if fraud platforms are the heroes of false positive reduction, where should merchants be looking, really?
Yeah, I think there are several ways to approach the false positive problem. And I would say that most businesses, they would need to start at quantifying it before they even think about solving it. But let's say that you have quantified the problem, and you have a good sense of how big it is and what you can do with it, and even whether this is under your control or not. I think one of the things that I often talk about, and I think most businesses don't really think about when it comes to detecting and preventing false positives, is using data enrichment vendors. And when I say data enrichment, what I mean by that is data vendors that specialize in providing more intelligence on very specific elements of a transaction, of a payment. This can be more intelligence about the identity, more intelligence about the device, the IP address, the shipping address, the email phone. It's pretty much endless, but these are the kind of vendors that I'm talking about.
Mm. Yeah, that is really interesting. As we're moving into an AI-powered world, it's helping us all do great things, but it's also helping, fraudsters get more sophisticated, and weeding out the good guys from the bad guys is becoming increasingly more difficult. So not moving away from rules, just static rules, basic rules, looking at all these additional data elements to give you a much more sophisticated means of identifying a good customer are becoming more critical. I guess it's sort of thinking about it, looking at how we used to do things, maybe looking at an X-ray, but with all these extra things, it's more like an MRI scan. You can really see everything that's going on. So we really want these vendors to be sort of helping you to identify the good customers, and in so doing, you will weed out the bad customers. So why do you think data enrichment is currently so overlooked? If it's so powerful, why do merchants and PSPs tend to overlook them?
Yeah, I think several reasons. One, as we mentioned, a lot of businesses, when they look outside to acquire more vendors, more data, whatever, they do so with the intent to reduce fraud, or with a very kind of like fraud reduction specific angle to how they run their RFIs. So this is definitely one. The other one is that most data vendors out there, I would say that like 9 out of 10 are not offering themselves a full-blown fraud platform where you can manage your fraud operations end to end. And so they are a point solution that you plug into your system, your existing fraud system, in order to enable new capabilities. But this is probably not the first thing that you want to put in place. First, you want to put in place a fraud system. And so usually fraud data vendors would be only the second or the third vendor that you would think about. And obviously, you would need to be a much more mature merchant or business. The fraud problem needs to be, or the false positive problem needs to be strong enough for you to even consider a third fraud vendor and so on. So I would say this is one other reason, and maybe a last reason would be that I think that actually because of what you said, I think there's a lot of fascination with AI and machine learning over the last decade, and definitely over the last couple of years. And when I see teams acquire data vendors, I see them use mainly the score. What is the score, the risk score of this email? What is the risk score of this IP? And this might be good for detecting malicious actors, for detecting fraud. But actually, when you want to uncover false positives, you want to be much more specific than that. You want to look at very specific features, and you actually want to write rules. You don't want to use machine learning in these cases. And I think this counterintuitive approach, which is also very different than how you manage fraud in general today, I think this is why people don't really think about data vendors.
Yeah, it is very interesting to me because I clearly work in this space and with many merchants to help improve successful outcomes and fraud. Fraud detection is the cornerstone of optimization. So reducing the risk and weeding out these false positives and therefore increasing the bottom line is what it's all about for me when I work with merchants. A big insight for me is fraudsters, they leave tracks, and it's one of my favorite concepts from your newsletter. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts and how this distinction is everything.
Yes, so it's a very good point. So when we're talking about payment fraud, we're talking about a fraudster either using a payment method, let's say a credit card, or an identity in the case of buy now pay later transaction that doesn't belong. So what fraudsters try to do is to hide the fact that this card or this identity don't belong to them. How do they, or why? For several reasons. One, they want to seem like the legitimate buyer. Two, they also don't want to expose themselves, right? They won't put their real name and their address, at least if they're not living in a law-abiding country. So this is kind of like the default state of how fraudsters run fraud in payments. And so when you look at a payment, one of the main things that you want to do from a fraud detection perspective is to suss out whether you see a cohesiveness between all the identity elements and also between that and how the user behaves. So all of that needs to match. And if you see these mismatches, then you start being suspicious. So for example, one example for that would be if I see an IP coming from a very strange country or a very strange location, that would make me suspicious, right? Because why would that person be there? These are exactly the kind of mismatches that we're looking at. Now, when it comes to how it plays out to false positives and data vendors, what data vendors can help you do is not only find out these mismatches, but also to find out the fact that a fraudster is covering their tracks. Because a fraudster can cover their track by hiding their IP address and appearing in a different place, but they can also hide their track in the sense that they use a clean device, right? They don't want this device to be attached to any kind of like past fraud cases, past chargebacks, and so on. So when I'm looking and I'm seeing a new device, what does that actually tell me as a fraud prevention specialist? Does it tell me that this is just a normal person with a new device that I haven't seen before? Or is it maybe a fraudster that cleaned up their tracks? The point is that legitimate users don't act, right? When you look at a legitimate transaction. Mostly, you want to see that all of the different elements have a long, vast, rich history. You've seen this device before, you've seen this email before, you've seen this phone before, you've seen this IP before, and even better, you've seen them correlating or affiliated with this specific user. And if you can see that, if you can prove that, then you can say, oh, this person left tracks. I know they are a good person, so I can let them through. And the absence of data is not necessarily a good thing, and I would even say is a suspicious thing. And this is exactly where data vendors can help you create this distinction.
It is really interesting that these positives are actually more reliable than trying to catch the negatives. That the fraudsters rotate their devices, their IP, the things that you've just mentioned, and that they shed their identifiers is kind of a bit like a horrible analogy, but like a snake shedding its skin, and good customers just don't do that. They leave patterns, and those patterns are actually the things that we need to be, looking at more, and that we don't. So that's fascinating. So really just thinking about, this with merchants in mind, let's share maybe some real world examples of enrichment logic that reduces the false positives instantly. So with your experience.
I think the best case example is really to connect this payment to a past payment from this user. And just by saying that, even from this device, I've seen this name or this email connected to this device, and they bought something 3 months ago, and that transaction, that payment wasn't disputed. That already is a very good sign. Does that mean that 100% I won't get a chargeback here? No, you don't ever have 100% assurance. This is why it's called fraud management and not fraud elimination. But it is very, very likely that you won't get one. So this is one example. Another example can be when you get an email, a payment that is attached to or associated with an email that, for example, belongs to Microsoft.com. And the email is also approved or verified, right? So maybe somewhere along the user journey, they verified their email. So what I see here is a customer that has a Microsoft.com email. That means they work at Microsoft. They also showed me that they have access to that email. So I really know that this is them. Now I need to ask myself, A, would a Microsoft employee commit online fraud? And B, would they do that with their real email? And since the answer is not likely to both of these questions, again, I don't have a proof that this is a legitimate customer, but it is statistically very, very likely that this is a good customer. Another example that I can give, I always give that, from my time at PayPal, I would mainly look at the North American population. And, when you would see a shipping address in Afghanistan, obviously that would look very suspicious, right? If a new MacBook is being sent to Afghanistan, you don't want that. But if you look at the address and you see that this is actually a military base of the US Army in Afghanistan, that changes the picture, right? It is very unlikely that someone is committing fraud from a US military base in Afghanistan, and again, exposing themselves within that kind of like military environment to allegations. So these are just a couple of examples from the top of my head, and you have a lot of these. And the point here is to use very specific features and not necessarily the risk score that doesn't really exposes these kind of stories.
I could talk to you for ages on this topic. I think there's so much more we could unpack. But I think just as we do have to close fairly soon, I just wanted to talk briefly around return on investment. So let's talk about return on investment. False positive reduction is intensely high for ROI, right?
Yes, definitely. I would say quickly two things. First, it is very likely that you don't need to invest anything in order to improve your position with false positives, especially if you haven't done that before. And especially if you're already collecting device intelligence, IP intelligence, email intelligence for fraud reduction purposes. You already have this data. It's just about using and looking at it from a different angle. So this is one thing. The second thing, also take into account that there are secondary benefits for approving these false positives. It is not just that you get the revenue for that transaction, but this is also you preventing the lost customer acquisition cost that many times drive the losses of false positives to be so high when you compare them to fraud. It is exactly because you already spent all the marketing cost and then ended up blocking the users that came to your shop.
100%. I mean, Chen, thank you. This is such an important conversation, and honestly one that is least understood within fraud strategy. And I would like to thank all the listeners for listening to this MPE Talk episode, part of the MPE 2026 conference happening in March 17th to 19th in Berlin, and we hope to see you there.